Telebait here, doing another big breakdown on how I make decisions in games, and this decision making process helps me reach Master every season. The video will be mostly focusing on general ideas, so if you want to see how I apply these ideas, check out my other deck guide videos where I go through my gameplay and do my best to explain what I'm thinking about in the moment. Before applying this and going into each game, you'll need some basic understanding of the game, so I'm assuming you have a good understanding of the fundamentals of the game. If you don't, check out my beginner's guide. You need to know what type of deck you're playing versus what type of deck your opponent's playing and who is playing the faster deck. So if you're aggro, you're looking to maximize damage, and if you're control, you're looking to minimize the damage you take and win by card advantage. And if you're a similar speed to your opponent, your main game plan would be winning by value, so card advantage, but some hand states could cause you to go for a more aggressive game plan against your opponent. And you'll also need a really good idea of what deck your opponent's using. If you're trying to work out what your opponent's using, I recommend checking out the Mobalytics website, and most people will just copy the top decks from there. So going into how we make decisions, in general, when you have an action, there are 3 options you can do. You can open attack, you can develop, and you can also pass. In general, my rules are your default, what you should originally think to do is pass. And only if there's a good reason not to pass, then you should look to develop. And if there's a good reason not to develop, then you should look to attack. Passing is a great tool because passing allows you to always react to what your opponent's doing. And playing reactive is so strong because you have 100% of the information of what your opponent's doing this round. And I will say, passing is probably the hardest tool to use well. Even in Master, I see a lot of people pass wrong, and I think I pass wrong a lot of the time as well. Things I check for before I pass are, you need to be okay if your opponent passes back. Are you happy if neither player does anything this turn? And this is why the slower deck's always better, because your opponent, if you're playing the slower deck, your opponent doesn't have that option of passing back. And even if they do pass back, you're happy because you're playing the slower deck. The next thing to consider is who will waste more mana. So if your opponent will waste more mana when they pass back, you're more okay to pass. And if you're playing only a slightly faster deck or a similar speed deck, burning that extra mana can make a big difference. So if your opponent has more banked spell mana than you need to consider using the pass tool, getting them to do their action first, and that way you can react off 100% of the information. And the last thing to consider is if you are happy with the board state, because even if you're playing a slower deck, if you pass and keep leaving yourself in a bad board state and your opponent open attacks, that can get you really low on Nexus health really quickly. So that's something you need to be careful of. And one last thing to take note of is you can do what I call burst passing. That's when you use a burst speed card and then pass, because even if your opponent passes back, the round doesn't end and you can still do something, so you don't waste your turn. And this is a good way of passing the initiative while being the quicker deck, is using a burst spell speed and then passing. So if you decide passing is not the best thing for you to do this turn, your next option is to develop or attack. The main way I think about this is you need to think if developing improves your attack. So if you play a unit and your opponent plays the best unit he can this round, and this is where knowing your opponent's deck list comes in helpful, because then you can work out what's the most threatening unit they can play this round. Does that make your attack better or worse? And if it makes your attack worse, then I'll choose the attack. If it makes your attack better, then you're better off developing. The other important thing to consider is slow speed responses. So cards like Ruination and Avalanche are the main ones I'm thinking of. There could be other cards like Reckoning. It's these big board clears. You don't want to play another unit, have your opponent play a big board clear and basically get that extra unit you just played free. So in those situations, that's when you're better attacking in as well. And the last thing to consider is sometimes threatening attack is actually better than attacking. And the main one I'm thinking of is if you play something like Dragon Guard Lieutenant, a 3/2 challenger, and it's turn 3 and your opponent could play something like a Draven, but they're going to wait for you to attack before playing that Draven. And you need to weigh up what's more important, getting that free damage in from the attack or stopping your opponent developing Draven. And usually stopping your opponent developing their champion is a really strong play. So in that situation, you're actually better off just not attacking and developing before you attack, or possibly even not attacking at all that round, so your opponent doesn't have a chance to play the unit he wants to. So if you decided you need to develop, there's a few questions you should be asking yourself before you play any unit. Are you protecting any of your units with banked mana? So if you've got enough mana for something like Deny, You don't want to be burning out yourself out of deny mana and then leave yourself open to all your opponent's removal. So you need to consider what you could be threatening in your hand, and this is including cards that aren't in your hand. Bluffing is a big part about Legends of Runeterra, so you should consider cards in your deck that you're bluffing, not just the cards in your hand. And the other thing to consider with all this banked mana is, what are you threatening on the next turn? You need to plan at least one turn ahead and consider your spell mana into your next turn, because maybe next turn there's a card you need to threaten. And the other thing which is really important is, does he have any big threats that you need to bank mana or bluff responses for? You always want to know what units your opponent's playing which are key to their strategy. Usually this is champions. I've released a Swain Sejuani deck recently, and a key unit in that deck is Leviathan, so it's not exclusively champions, but sometimes it's big units as well. For example, if you're playing around your opponent's Leviathan, from turn 8 onwards, you want to always bluff a response, be that something like a Concerted Strike, or Vengeance, or a Homecoming. You want to always keep up that mana that your opponent can never safely play their big threat. And the last thing to consider before you're developing is, what can your opponent do to remove your development? It's important to consider, do you care if they remove your unit? If you're playing like a random unit which you're not really too fussed about, then you're probably not too bothered if they remove it. You need to consider, can you protect that unit, and do you have enough banked mana to protect the unit with? And you also need to consider, if they've got a threat for your unit, can you actually avoid that threat? So let's say you're playing Nasus Fresh and you're against a deck using Cullen Strike. If you drop Fresh is a 5 mana card and your opponent can kill it with a 3 mana card. That's a really, really bad trade. But the truth is, you're never going to be in a position against a decent player where you have 5 unit mana and your opponent has less than 3 spell mana. It's just not a realistic situation you'll ever end up in. So in that situation, what you do is you just play the Fresh and hope your opponent doesn't have Culling Strike, because they're always going to be able to kill your Fresh with the Culling Strike. There's nothing you can do about it. And in those situations, it's better to make the play immediately, because then your opponent has drawn less cards and they're less likely to hit the Culling Strike. The longer you delay that play, the more likely they are to draw into the Culling Strike. The next thing I want to cover, which is kind of under development as well, is removal. It's more like anti-development, but a lot of the principles are the same. So the first 3 principles I covered in developing are the exact same, which is, you need to consider, are you in a good board state? If you're in a good board state, do you really need to do anything? Are you protecting any of your units with bank mana? You don't want to burn yourself below that protection mana. And do you need to bluff or bank mana to remove any of his key units? Again, you don't want to burn yourself below that mana to remove his key units if you know he's able to play them. And some other things to consider when playing removal is the target the best target in his deck for that removal? If it's not the best target in the deck, then it's probably not worth using the removal on that. The only exception to this is if you're running a removal heavy deck, then you deal with all his small units by using removal, and you've got plenty of removal in his deck to deal with future units, so then you're happy. The next thing to consider is, can your opponent stop your removal? And is it possible to force your opponent below that protection mana? Again, this is, if your opponent can stop it, you ideally want to play it in a situation where they run out of mana and can't stop it, but you need to think realistically, is your opponent going to go below that mana? And the last thing to consider is playing the removal spell now the best time? Often removal timed at the right time can get extra value. The next bit of decision making I want to consider is attacking. So this is when you've decided attacking is your best play here. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what combat tricks can your opponent use, and take them into account for all your trades and see if you've got good responses to those combat tricks. If not, don't attack in with units which are going to give you bad trades with those combat tricks. Which leads me on to my next thing. Do you care about getting good trades and value from your attack? So aggro decks generally don't care about these good trades, and you just attack in with everything and get as much damage as possible. And when you're attacking with your units, you need to consider how your opponent is going to block. What I like to do is I put my units out and then I pause and think for a moment. If I was my opponent, how would I block my units? Think about that, work that through in your head, and then decide, are you happy with these trades if this is how your opponent blocks? Last few, I would say these are tips for when you play an attack, is you should always challenge units if you can. There is zero reason not to challenge if you can. It just takes the choice away from your opponent. And next thing to consider is to avoid pre-committing combat tricks. If your attack is only good if you pre-commit a combat trick, and what I mean by this is you use your buff spells before you hit that attack button, then you really need to rethink, is this the best thing? Because if it's 100% safe, then I'm okay with it. If there is any risk with pre-committing combat tricks, such as your opponent using Vengeance or some sort of removal on whatever you've just buffed, I would really question you pre-committing the combat tricks, and I avoid doing this as much as possible. For defending turns, a lot of the decision making is the same for developing and passing, but obviously you don't have this choice of attacking. The only thing which is slightly different is when your opponent attacks, you get to decide how to block. But a lot of this is similar to deciding when to attack. Consider what combat tricks your opponent can use. Consider if you are under the threat of dying, if your opponent has over-the-top burn spells, so things like Get Excited, Decimate, and potential buffs that they can use on their units. So block enough that if your opponent has the sort of best hand to finish you off with, that they still can't do it. But you need to be careful about this, because you don't want to throw away all your strong units because they potentially have a 3-card combo which would kill you, because you need to make sure you're still in a position where you can win the game after the opponent's attack. But in general, my approach to this is you always just take the best trades you can. So the last thing I want to cover about decision making, it kind of covers a few areas. I'm just going to refer to it as playing around the stack. So the stack comes from either you or your opponent attacking, or you and your opponent playing a slow or fast speed spell. And this starts a process where you can go back and forth playing cards to counter what your opponent's doing on the stack. If you followed all my previous advice, you should be putting yourself into a good position for these stacks. But a lot of the correct responses are very situational, so it's hard to give you a clear advice. Generally, the best response is the most obvious one. But even when you think it's dead obvious what the best response is, take a couple of seconds just to consider all your potential options. Sometimes some weird trick or weird combination of cards can actually work out better than what you originally thought was the best option. So hopefully this decision making video will help you out going in the future. This is my sort of general thought making process, and it was quite difficult to actually put this together just because there's so many things you always have to consider. A lot of things are really situational. Let me know if you found it helpful, and if you want to see me apply these principles, definitely check out some of my deck videos. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a good day.